Thanks. So I'm quite fortunate because I have a unique postdoc at the center. I'm 50% with the center and 50% with WorldFish. So I'm going to be drawing on some of the research from my PhD and then some of the research that is ongoing. So I think that everyone in this room has probably given a public lecture before. And if you have, you know how challenging it can be to sit in front of a blank PowerPoint presentation and try and figure out what to say about your research. And I think the reason it's so hard to summarize what we do in 10 or 15 minutes is because giving a talk forces us to step away from those details that we're so good at and face some of the big headline questions, such as, what's the point of my research? Is it useful to anybody, and am I having an impact? So the work I'm talking about today is an adaptation of a framework that tries to get at those tough questions. What is the different impact of various interventions? Before I get into the particulars of the framework and how we've adapted it, I'd like to situate my work at the headline level. So I'm an environmental social scientist, and at the biggest level, what I'm working towards is small-scale fisheries sustainability, for two reasons primarily. The first, and Dave showed this infographic from WorldFish, the oceans feed people. Not only is fish a really healthy protein that can decrease cancer rates, decrease obesity, help with heart disease, in the developing world, fish contribute really vital micronutrients. We know that there are 1 billion hungry people on the planet, and we expect that problem to just grow as the population grows towards mid-century and as climate change changes rainfall patterns and starts to create drought in a lot of the world's bread baskets. This means that the ocean's proteins will just become increasingly more important to addressing that hunger problem. So not only is fish a very healthy protein, it's also potentially a very sustainable protein. In comparison to a lot of the terrestrial proteins, fish uses less fresh water, it uses less land space, it has a lower carbon footprint. So a lot of people actually refer to fish as the perfect protein. If we look at small-scale fisheries in comparison to commercial fisheries, this story gets even better. As Dave outlined, the small-scale sector employs a lot of people. Estimates are difficult to come across. This graph by Colding and colleagues estimates that there are over 30 million directly employed by the fishery. Dave Mills has suggested that that number is closer to 100 million direct jobs and then close to $500 million when you include all the secondary jobs, a lot of which are women. Not only does it employ more people, small-scale fisheries has the capacity to be less environmentally damaging. There's generally less bycatch with small-scale fisheries. There's less fuel consumed to land fisheries. So the picture is more food, more jobs, less damage. But of course, it's not quite that simple. In comparison to large-scale fisheries, small-scale fisheries can provide some really challenging management contexts. Where you have a large-scale fishery, which might be a small fleet of relatively large boats that target one species in particular, that report to one port, and they can all be captured under one management plan, small-scale fisheries are incredibly diverse. Fishers use all types of gear, they target multiple different species, they often use hundreds, thousands, more than that, of different ports, different beaches, so it really presents a unique management challenge. Fortunately for us, some of the top minds in social science have been thinking about these types of management challenges for decades, and they've provided us with some really robust theory that can assist us in addressing these types of challenges. The theory I'm talking about is the theory on governing the commons. So just a really quick refresher, the commons describes settings which are characterized by two things. First is a high subtractability. And what that means is if I use a particular resource, it's no longer available for you. So that's a fish. If I eat it, it's gone from the system. The second characteristic is low excludability. And what that means is it's very difficult for me or any of us to exclude someone else from extracting that particular resource. So, the challenge then, which is presented by the Commons, is the one that's made famous by Garrett Harding in 1968 in his science paper, which we've all heard of, Tragedy of the Commons. And in a nutshell, that says that if we don't provide some sort of regulation on these systems, humans who are inherently self-interested will just continue to exploit until the resource collapses. So until the 1980s, we thought that there were two ways to prevent tragedy of the commons. The first was to nationalize your commons. You put the central state in charge, they set up parks, and they exclude people. The second way was to privatize that, so you could become private property and it can prevent against overexploitation. But in the early 1980s, Elinor Ostrom came onto the scene, and she sort of revolutionized the way that we think about the commons. She said, actually, there's a third way that we can sustainably regulate commons use, and that people have been doing it for generations. She argued that when people can communicate, when they can build trust, and when they can develop norms of reciprocity, that means if I'm good to you, you'll be good to me in return, communities can actually successfully govern their resources, and they don't need market interventions or state assistance. So, building on her 40 years of thinking about the commons, which resulted in her winning the Nobel Peace Prize. She was the first woman to win the prize. This social-ecological systems framework was the culmination of that work and her last contribution to the field. Essentially, what this framework tries to do is give us a common language that lets us compare across different cases and lets us compare across different disciplines to produce bigger lessons about how we can govern these types of common systems. So at the most basic level, this is what the framework looks like. It describes how resource systems and resource units, governance systems and actors all feed into an interaction that varies from case to case and produces particular outcomes. And all of those components are nested within social and ecological settings. This goes further and actually unpacks to second-tier variables, which can be further unpacked into third, fourth, and fifth-tier variables. So to say that the framework is complex would be putting it mildly. There are 50 second-tier variables listed here, but the good news is it's meant to be comprehensive and start us with a very wide gaze, but we're meant to use theory to select the particular bits which are most useful to explaining our cases. The big question that I'm interested in is what enables particular communities to sustainably govern their resources? Perhaps it's Bermuda, as Jeremy Jackson was talking about, while other places lead to resource collapse. So to explain that question, or to try and get at some of the particulars, I've drawn on social theory to pull out elements from this framework that will be the most useful for explaining the outcomes we see. And I've pulled out three elements in particular. The first is an analysis of process. The second is an emphasis on subjectivity. And the third is the addition of power into this framework. I suggest that by looking at these three elements in particular, we'll be able to not only explain if our interventions are working, but actually start to answer how and why we see the different outcomes that we see. So for the remainder, I'm going to provide a few examples of how these three elements explain some of the outcomes that we're seeing in the cases, in the places where we work. So by process, what I mean is how things actually play out on the ground, because what we see on paper is often quite different than what we see in the communities and places where we work. For example, if you've got 6 rules for best practice in a particular fisheries governance, if you apply those rules in one community, the results you see are probably going to be quite different than the results you see in another community. So getting at the process and what actually happens is what I'm trying to get at through this component of the framework. So in Mozambique, I was interested in identifying and supporting how fishers were adapting to declining fish stocks. Based on the literature, the assumption is that wealthier people are in a better position to adapt to shocks. For example, after a big climactic event comes through, say a tsunami hits a community, the first thing that we do to try and rebuild those communities' capacity to continue and to adapt is to replace material wealth, things like boats and fishing gear. So we did household surveys, and we did find that 2 communities that we were looking at, one was characterized as quite wealthy community, the community on the left, and the other was community was quite poor. So what the theory would predict, or what we expected, was that the wealthy community would be more adaptive, more able to respond to declining fish catch. But I worked with these communities over a period of 3 years, and what we began to see as we worked deeper sort of into the process is that the poor fishers were actually more adaptive than the wealthy fishers. The poor fishers were quite responsive. They would take all kinds of different jobs in response to declining fish catch. They would work as bicycle taxi drivers. They would go into the cities and take daily work. They would join their spouses in the farming fields. Whereas the wealthy fishers, who had really invested in big, expensive boats and expensive nets, they were sort of locked in to a livelihood that they weren't able to change. And so their response to declining catches was to kind of wait it out. They said, we expect that this is a blip and it will bounce back, and we're just going to essentially hope for the best. So what we identified was there is actually potential economic barriers to adaptation. And that means that when we're looking to support these types of behaviors, there might be other interventions rather than just providing or investing in material assets. We might look for social support systems or livelihood diversification systems to try and strengthen fishers' ability to respond. Another major challenge for the governance of small-scale fisheries is in often cases we don't have a lot of data. On the left-hand side of this graph is total marine landings from Mozambique, and if you see the bit I've circled in red, we had a monster spike in the data that's very unusual. What happened here is they started for the first time recording the catch of small-scale fisheries in 2003. So clearly there's a huge gap in our ability to understand patterns in this fishery over time. But what we did was interview fishers that had been in the fishery for 15 years or more, and they were able to provide us with a wealth of information about the fishery. Not only could they recall catch crates, and we could estimate and back calculate reconstructed catches, they're also really able to explain to us how the different social and ecological components of the system interact. For example, they were able to describe how unemployment in inland Mozambique was resulting in all these new fishers coming and entering the fishery. They were able to tell us that the coastal fishery was essentially depleted, so they had shifted their effort offshore and were now targeting pelagic fish. They were able to tell us that when they had a low rainfall year, they knew that there would be a 2-year time lag before juvenile shrimp would start appearing in the coastal waters again, an observation of fishers that was actually verified by colleagues at the University of Mozambique quantitatively with Western-based science. So as Beth and as Dave have outlined more articulately than I will, if we fail to account for these kinds of complexities when we're trying to sustainably govern fisheries, the types of management tools that we have won't be as effective. So moving on to subjectivity, and what I mean by subjectivity is how I interpret information and therefore see a problem and an appropriate solution might be different than the way you interpret it. For example, an intervention that really conserves a resource and results in an increase in biomass may be perceived as a failure by a community if that means that they're completely excluded. So accounting for different subjectivities is an important part of how we understand impact in small-scale fisheries. We all know that ecological systems undergo regime shifts. And predicting and preventing them is critical for governance. But social systems undergo regime shifts as well. We can think of examples that we're familiar with, like the French Revolution or the fall of the Berlin Wall, or more recently, the Arab Spring. Sometimes a social system also exhibits a shift, and that can be important for fisheries governance as well. So I worked with 2 communities in Mozambique, and we tried to understand what characterized their system, what were the fundamental components, and what would it mean, or what would it look like if a shift occurred. So working with these 2 communities, we decided, they told me, that fishing was really the central characteristic of those communities, and if they were no longer able to fish, that would represent a fundamental change in the components of the system for them. We were able to actually pinpoint what a threshold point would be for each community. It was about 75% decline in their current fish rates. Fishers would stop fishing. But the really fascinating bit was their response to that threshold depended on their identity. In one of our communities, the fishers were largely migrants. They had moved from other places to fish in that place. And they said, once the fish are gone, we'll move on and we'll continue following the resource. The other community, the fishers were all born and raised in their place, and they said, this is our home, this is the place that our ancestors have lived, and if the fish are gone, we'll stay here and we'll have to look for other jobs. So this is important for us because how people respond to thresholds could either directly add pressure or alleviate pressure from marine resources. So a second example of subjectivity, I'd like to move to Solomon Islands. And the intervention that we're looking at primarily in Solomons is community-based resource management. It's proliferated around the country. There are over 137 projects that have initiated community-based management in the Solomon Islands. But that doesn't necessarily mean we understand what's happening in these communities. What kind of ecological effects are coming out of these projects are questions for colleagues of ours. What I can answer, or try, as a social scientist is, are these community-based management initiatives changing behavior, changing the way people use resources or manage their resources? So to understand the context, Pete filled us in a little bit. Customary marine tenure has been the way that communities interact with and manage their resource in the Pacific for centuries and generations. Largely, customary marine tenure was based on social motivations. So communities would close a particular reef to build up resources that they would harvest for a social event, to mark the death of a prominent community member or for a particular feast. So in contemporary context, there are so many more pressures on those systems that the customary marine tenure is not necessarily robust enough to handle all the new stressors. So when we try to work with communities and institute community-based resource management, one of the things that we're trying for is a shift in mentality from managing a resource based on social motivations to managing it based more on an ecological basis. So what we found in the communities that we work with is some communities were actually adopting some of that conservation ethos. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, they're starting to introduce largely closed management areas in an effort to conserve resources, which is a shift and is something new, an impact that we're having. But a fascinating component of the story is explained in the bottom right-hand picture. Communities are still using their traditional management practices as well. So the introduction of a new type of management behavior hasn't been based on the exclusion of another. And if we're looking for socially appropriate solutions to governance, we have to try and build on these community structures. They're important for management because different management interventions actually can elicit different compliance behavior from communities. For example, in some places, the more contemporary conservation-based closure doesn't carry as many sanctions as a traditional closure. An example of a way we might be able to incorporate this into the way that we work with communities is, for example, in a community where the church is a really important part of the daily lives of in the places that we work, we could ask, or we could work with the church to actually implement these types of closures that might carry a little bit heavier weight and result in higher compliance with those types of management interventions. So the third component of the framework that we're looking at is power. And anyone who knows any social scientist knows that power is the really be-all and end-all. It's often what people think explains everything that we see. I would go as far as to argue that power is to social scientists what Jonathan Thurston is to the cowboys. What I'd like to do is explain how power can help us understand the differences that we saw in 5 communities where we worked. So we worked with 5 communities in Solomon Islands to implement community-based resource management, and 2 of them were successfully able to sustain it. It's still ongoing, and that's after an 8-year period working with them. Whereas 3 communities, it wasn't able to get up and running. And so I'll give you some examples as to why that might be. In the 2 communities where community-based resource management was implemented, there was a real sense of ownership over the process. Community members would swim their reef before they would harvest, and they would decide based on the resource status whether they would harvest or not. So they were taking ownership and they were adapting the management plan to suit their purposes. In another example, after a 1-month opening, they observed that there was a really sharp decline in their resources, so they shortened the next opening to 2 weeks. So they were owning the process and adapting it for their purposes. As another example, which is an interesting sort of nuance of people, we're complex creatures, one of the communities where we worked asked WorldFish to help them furnish a resource center in their community. And that's a type of behavior that we've seen in other communities. When you come in as an external partner, there's potentially opportunities that are provided. So understanding the reasons that communities participate in management interventions can be complex. It's not necessarily the same sort of purpose or outcome as we have. We've seen cases where communities engage in this type of management as a bit of a means more than an actual outcome. In the communities where community-based resource management wasn't successfully implemented, we argue that power can actually explain some of the challenges that we saw. So community-based management tries to make decision-making a little bit more broad and more inclusive. So the resource committee was made up of different community members. And what we actually found was when that resource committee tried to implement rules, the Reef owning clan, which had traditional ownership and had more power to actually decide who used the resource or not, they were able to sort of veto the resource committee. So moving on, because I'm running out of time. If you take home one thing from my talk today, I would like it to be this. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. The outcomes of small-scale fishery governance are very complex, and in many cases, they represent an ongoing challenge. I think that due to the gap between the theory that we have and the actual practice on the ground, some of the results that we see are often disappointing. By exploring how and why we see the outcomes that we see through the lens of process, subjectivity, and power, I argue that we're going to lessen the gap between theory and practice, leading to better outcomes on the ground, in theory, to more abundant oceans that can provide more food and more jobs for coastal people. Thank you.